Okay, today we're going to do a review lesson for the midterm exam. I need to do that because trying to condense everything down in 20-minute segments where I'd normally take an hour or longer. I do two 20-minute sessions a week this way where I do three 1-hour classes or 50-minute classes if we were on campus. And so I wind up condensing. A lot of times I pass over stuff so quickly I might not give it the emphasis that you think is necessary to consider it worthwhile memorizing or remembering. And then sometimes I miss things. I saw one thing in here I missed. I could just drop it off the exam, but I think it's kind of important, so I'll cover it in this review. So I'll be going over the test. Right here I have it. Pay attention, because if you don't, you'll probably be sorry. In my philosophy and in a class like this, you pretty much have to answer what I think. You can have your own opinions, but on the test, it's what I think. So I think I have a good reason for what I say. I think I can back it up quite well. But in the end, it is what I presented in class, and it's what I expect you to come back with an answer on. The primary purpose for the church, in my opinion, is the evangelization of the world. It's God's instrument for the salvation of all mankind. We gather together in a church and we encourage one another. We grow spiritually and everything. Why? So we can evangelize the world, and we can be God's instrument for that purpose. Now, with that being the case, I think every single person in the church should be an integral part of the mission outreach of the church. Now, they might be part of the missions committee, they might not. If they're not, they still should be praying, they still should be giving sacrificially, they still should be seeing themselves and actively being a part of that effort of the church to reach the entire world with the gospel of Jesus Christ. For me, the primary meaning of the word missionary isn't anybody we support. It's not necessarily somebody we're going to send money to. It's somebody who crosses linguistic and cultural boundaries to share the gospel, and usually national boundaries too, but not always. There's plenty of places in America now where you can cross cultural and linguistic barriers and stay right within the U.S. So in this, I really do want to emphasize, I think everybody should be an integral part of this team through their support and prayers and whatever else. If they're going to be a part of the actual organization, missions committee or whatever, that's fine. But if they're not, they're still a part of the missions outreach, and they should see themselves as such. Now, if missions is the most important aspect of the church, it's a purpose why it exists, we probably ought to spend a whole lot more time studying the biblical meaning and methodologies and all of that about missions in the Bible. We don't do that. Heard a lot of sermons on the eldership, a lot of sermons on all sorts of things. But how many times you heard a sermon on how missions were done in the Bible, how missionaries supported themselves, how they were organized? Not much. And we really ought to be spending some time studying about that. Now, I don't think I gave you the word Heilgeschichte. I'll mention it again in the final exam preparation. I want you to learn it. Heilgeschichte is a term. Heil means saved. You know, Heil Hitler during, you see the old World War II movies. And all the Germans are, giving that Nazi salute and everything. Well, that meant save. It come from, like in England, they'd say God save the king or God save the queen or whatever. It was sort of like just a saying that they had. And so Heil meant save, and Geschichte meant history. So it's the salvation history. And in the Bible, it's a term which sort of unifies, or it's a concept which unifies all of these little stories and everything that's going on. If you take that salvation history out, the Bible becomes somewhat meaningless. It's just a bunch of stories. And I think that's where a lot of people who don't believe in the Bible miss it. And they say, it's just a book of old people's tales and stories and that kind of stuff. They've missed the point, and so they don't see how it's all hooked together. Now, there are a lot of issues in cross-cultural communication, language and the logical structure that's behind it, the cultural norms that are used for social interaction, hand and body gestures, nonverbal communication. All of those are significant issues for the person that's going to be involved in cross-cultural communication. Now, something I didn't emphasize, I kind of just touched on it as I went by, and I'm not even sure I mentioned it specifically and directly. What's the purpose of Israel in all this? So a lot of people today say, Israel's a special people of God. They were chosen by God to be saved, all this. That's wrong. It's not biblical. The people of Israel were chosen to be a messenger. They were chosen to be a vessel. That's what's clear in Abraham when I had that proto-evangelium. You're going to be blessed so you can be a blessing to all the families of the earth. If you're not going to be a blessing to all the families of the earth, then you're not going to be blessed. It was a simple, functional relationship. And we get off base when we start saying, oh, they're the chosen people of God. Like somehow they were God's favorite. They were someone that God chose. That's what he did with Abraham. He wasn't a better person, and that's what he does with Israel as well. Now, the focus of this gospel, of this proto-evangelium, is that unifying thread, as I said. It's a message of blessing to be a blessing. It's for all people. It was for the Jewish nation first. It's for you and me today. That's why we're saved. Not only for us personally, sure, that too, but also that being saved, we can share salvation, the good news of salvation with others. The word evangelium or gospel means the teachings of Christ. Now, it's a story of his ministry and his life, sure, but it's the teachings that give that life and ministry a purpose. It's good news for all of humanity. Yes, it is. It's a story of the foundation of the church. That's where it began. But when you talk about the actual word, evangelium or gospel, what's it mean? The word gospel means good news. Evangelium, good news. And so it's a good news for all humanity. It's all these other things true. And when I have a test question, a lot of times I'll have 2 or 3 answers that are partly right, but one is the right answer. And so when you say, what's the evangelium or gospel mean or refer to? It's the good news of God, God's good news for all of humanity. The gospel presentation of the Great Commission is presented every one of the Gospels and the book of Acts. 5 different times we find the Great Commission there. It's presented 5 different times because each gospel kind of focused on different people groups. And God wanted to make sure that no people group thought they were outside of that commitment to preach the gospel. That's how we know the Great Commission is for everybody and not just for the disciples in the early biblical period. Now, the Bible says we're to be witnesses in Jerusalem, Judea, Samaria, and even to the ends of the earth. Does that mean we got to win everybody here first? No. It means we do them all at the same time. Yeah, they started out because that's where they were. They had to get something done there first. And very quickly they started moving into Samaria and then all of Judea, then out to the ends of the earth. But since that's already been done, and here there's already been a lot done wherever we are, that means we're to be preaching the gospel into the whole world. The book of Revelation. Now, I didn't really touch on that here, and I should have. And I'm going to include it because I do have it in the midterm. I have it in the final. The book of Revelation is the story of a church that is suffering persecution. It's the story of how evil is going to attack the church, but that the church is going to prevail and that the ones who prevail will be saved in the end, that evil will not prevail. That's the purpose of the book of Revelation. It's there like 4 different times in like the same story repeated in different ways. Purpose of Revelation isn't to tell you when things are going to happen in the future or all that silliness about the millennium and that kind of stuff. It's to give confidence to a church that's being persecuted. Back in those days, sure, the church was persecuted. And today, many places around the world, and a persecuted church finds great solace and encouragement in the book of Revelation. Now, the missionary nature of God's work, our understanding of the missionary nature of God's work, it's to help us in our identity as individuals and in the nature of the church. It's part of what we are. It's part of our nature. It's part of what we're to do. Social science, as a science, I've studied social science, anthropology, psychology, all that kind of stuff. And why do I study it? Well, because it helps us to know the world around us. It helps us to understand the people that we're dealing with. So the social sciences in the evangelistic outreach of the church are very useful. All of them, sociology, anthropology, and psychology. And I encourage every one of you to get as much of that as you can possibly do. You'll often hear the term Rice Christian. I didn't mention that in the teaching, and I probably should have when I was talking about dependency. Back in the old days in India and China and stuff, they'd sit there and say, okay, everybody comes to church, I'll give you a pound of rice. Well, everybody go to church, get a pound of rice. Well, the day missionaries couldn't give out rice anymore, nobody came to church. All they went to church for was to get their pound of rice. And so when we start giving things out to encourage people to come to church, they'll come to church to get something, but they won't come to church to get the gospel. They won't come to the church to find salvation. So that's the reason we should not use material things to try to entice people in. If we're going to use them, it has to be done very, very carefully, and we're going to talk a whole lot about that in this class, and that's one of your textbooks you have to read too, by the way. Why did God select Abraham? Not because Abraham was better than everybody else, not because he was somehow perfect. He was just somebody willing to do what God told him to do. He had all the same warts and problems that everybody around him did, and we see God working through that in his life. So he wasn't special. He wasn't better than anyone else. He was just a guy that said, yeah, I'll go. I'll do it. And God used him. And the purpose of calling Abraham, why he had to leave his own country, he couldn't see his own sins and shortcomings as long as he stayed home. And that's what a missionary does. As a missionary goes out, it helps the American church to see the American church's shortcomings and failures. The idolatry of Abraham didn't look so bad, but when he saw the idolatry of the Palestinians, of the ones in Canaan, the Canaanites, it looked terrible. And it was only then he could start seeing how his idolatry looked to God. Now, in the final judgment, God going to save everybody? No, he's not. Is God going to condemn them to hell and throw them in the fire? Not really. Read John 3:16 and 17, all that. It says they aren't saved because they did not accept the one and only Son of God. And so people condemn themselves by rejecting Christ, by not accepting Christ. And God simply confirms that in the final judgment. He is a loving God. He does care about us. His purpose and his work is for salvation. Will some go to hell, and will that be confirmed in the final judgment? Yes, it will. But it won't be God saying, hey, I don't like you, so you're going to move there and burn for eternity. Hey, I like you, so you're coming up here. It's God offers salvation to everyone. The ones that accept it, go in. The ones that don't, they have chosen their final destination. And God in the final judgment will confirm it and say, look, you had the opportunity. You didn't take it. There's your place. Why are modern Christians so reluctant to accept and use Paul's methods? We live in a very fast-moving world of instant gratification. And Paul, even though things went pretty quick, it wasn't instant gratification. He worked his tail off, and he worked his entire life to accomplish what he accomplished. So Americans are often reluctant to study it, to use it and everything, because we want it to happen now. And that's why we get into social ministry so much. I'm going to feed the hungry. There's 10,000 meals. We've done it. We're finished. That instant gratification thing. I didn't talk about the imprecatory Psalms. I should have. That's a bunch of Psalms where it's talking about God just destroy them, wipe them out, kill them all that. It says, blessed is he who smashes the Babylonian babies against the rock. Well, what's going on there? They had just witnessed their own children being dashed against the walls and having them, just crushed and killed that way. And in that sense of frustration and anger, they're wishing the same thing for the Babylonians. God doesn't want us to wish bad for anyone, but when we're really hurting, we feel that way. And so the imprecatory Psalms give us the ability to, look to God and say, hey, I'm hurting, it's terrible, I want you to do justice. And we can say anything we want to say to God, and he'll listen and he'll care. But it doesn't always mean everything in the Bible is what he wants us to do. I mean, it says Judas went out and hung himself. That doesn't mean God wants you to go out and hang yourself. Certainly not. And so these imprecatory Psalms are an honest expression of hurt and of suffering and of a people that have just been devastated in this destruction of Jerusalem and in the captivity. And God lets them do that. He doesn't punish them for that. It's an example of speaking from your heart. And we can do that with God. And I think that's the important thing of the imprecatory song. But that they cannot be used as a reason not to preach the gospel to someone. We can hate somebody because of the way they've hurt us, but we still should care to the point of wanting to see them repent and be saved. And so that's kind of the message that we get there. The theology of missions in the Bible makes it very clear. It's a responsibility of you and of me and of everyone to make sure the gospel gets out there, and we should be a part of that missionary outreach in some way. Hopefully some of you will go. Maybe hopefully all of you will go. But if you don't go, you better be pushing it with all your might back here in the States, in whatever church that you're in, to make sure that all the people hear the good news of the Lord Jesus Christ. That's a pretty good review for the midterm exam. And since I used almost all of those questions on the final exam, it's a good review for that one too. If you take this test and miss some of these questions, figure out what you did wrong, write me if you can't figure it out, and then I'll help you clarify it, because you'll see almost all of these questions again on the final exam. That's kind of the way I do things. Okay, very good. I wish you the very best in your midterm exam, and have a great time on spring break, and we'll get back together once midterm exam week and spring break week is over. God bless. Have a good and safe time of rest from your studies.